And so I just sat back because she's like me and we chatter a lot, but I watched her and she worked her magic, and by golly, if they didn't make a motion and move on that right then, and that's the way we're doing things. So sometimes I mean, I was the boss in this case, but I knew that she was the best person to transmit this message.
But it's interesting you brought that up because, like you said earlier, sometimes it can be one person in your personal life that, throws the wet blanket on everything just by their manner. But Allie is an excellent example of somebody who has such likability. Like, she's such a humble, likable person. Just her personality draws you in to listen, because she's not going to say something unless she's passionate about it, and it's important. And that's the complete opposite of what Erica was talking about and what you were talking about, and what Sue mentioned. It's those really difficult people that drive people away from jobs, away from volunteer projects.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
People who talk about themselves too much, who waste your time. Those are the people that kill projects, organizations, passionate ideas.
And I'm thinking as you were talking, I'm sorry, as you were talking about the people who are, I think, did we use the term don't care? Is that, I don't know.
Apathetic,
Apathetic. Is there ever a time that, okay, I'm going to ignore that group?
Yeah, you feel like at some point you're like, all right, we got to go.
Yeah.
Whether we leave them behind or like if you're going, we're going, right? Like
Right.
there is sometimes where time is of the essence. And like I said, I think once again, as the communicator, as the teacher, as the talker, and as the leadership, you have to look at the situation and see, there's some things where you're like, okay, we got to do this and we have to do it tomorrow. And I'm going to tell you, but I think if you communicate that, you know what I'm saying? And you're like, hey, I wish we had more time. I wish we could really work on this and get everybody on. And as you're talking, I think you just be honest and vulnerable. And that's where it comes back to where you sit down on the bench and say, all right, guys, I've given you all this information, and I wish we had more time to figure this out. However, due to X, Y, and Z, we have got to do this now. Like, there's just no, you know what I'm saying? And so I think if that vulnerability comes out, maybe even some of those apathetic people would be like, okay, I understand. You know what I'm saying? And I can get on board knowing that if we don't do this, then this is what's going to happen, and it's not going to be good for the whole.
When we built this room, we lost a couple or 3 families because they just didn't think it was necessary.
Sure.
And I look at it now in the way it's used and how many times people from the community come in, and I think what a good step it was.
Mm-hmm.
And those people haven't come back. But that's been 25 years, they're not coming back now.
Sure. Yeah, I lost a lot of people during the 2016 election, several families, because I wouldn't pick a candidate. And I just said it's just not important for what we're trying to do here at the church. Like, you can vote for whoever you want to, I don't care. And that wasn't the right thing to say, apparently.
Well,
but you just have to say, I'm sorry, but the way I interpret this, and I have one guy that came up to me, because I'll talk about politics, but it's very not what you would think probably, and especially for our part of the country. And that one guy's like, I know you always say the right thing, but I always cringe when you start talking about politics. And because I just say, we have bigger issues than who lives in a White House in Pennsylvania Avenue. Yeah, so but I didn't walk the party line, and you just have to look at those people and like, well, go find what it is you're looking for. And you know what I'm saying? That just it's not who we're going to be and what we're going to be about. All right, let me get to these last 3, because I think it'll help some of this conversation as well. So I think another way, so this is kind of talking about the same thing, but maybe just from a different perspective, and it brings up another point that I think is really good. And so once again, the first thing all starting with the letter A. What's the action? What are you trying to get to? What are you hoping will happen after you give this talk? And so it's kind of that, once again, transmitting, but what are we driving to here? The second thing that we got to think about is the attitude. Not just what will they do, but change how they see and feel about it. Am I trying to change their attitude about said topic? And then this last one, which I just love, and I think it gets at what we're talking about here, is atmosphere. And this goes to something bigger than just talking, but I'm actually trying to change the feel of the company or the culture of the company. And if we can get this atmosphere thing, like cooking, it's the space where attitudes, creating space where attitudes can change that will cause people to take different actions, okay? Attitudes change, and so it causes them to act differently. And if we can get to this, like if we can create an atmosphere, it will unleash this creativity in your people. It will unleash this, and they will have permission to be creative. They will have permission to think big. They will have permission to have ideas and to have input. And so I think sometimes we're going to have to transform what this whole thing is, and we're going to have to give people permission to speak into the understanding and the idea. The way I most often talk about this, and the way I love, and I think that when this happens, it's electric, is I'll be given a sermon, I'll preach, and then afterwards somebody will come up and they'll be like, "Hey, Pastor, that was awesome when you said," and then they'll say something. And then I'll be in my mind, it's like,
That's not what it said.
I didn't say that at all. I never said that. But there's an atmosphere
What they wanted to hear.
that they can start to think, oh man, this is maybe what is going on, and there's something bigger happening. And so it gives people permission to think and to really critically in their own heart and life. And so you may be talking about divorce, or you may be talking about whatever, or you may be talking about reports, and they hear something totally different. But if the atmosphere is a place in which people can think, I belong here, I have a voice here, I have creative input here. And so the action is important. What are we trying to get to? The attitude, I want to change the attitude and how they think about this, how they feel about this. But when we start to create an atmosphere in our talks and in what we're doing, it allows other things to surface in their lives, which then you're like, oh man, now this is awesome. And they may come to you and say, man, I have this idea. And as a leadership, you're like, that is the most terrible idea ever. You know what I'm saying? Like in the mind, you're like, that is rubbish, if you were from England. That's garbage, right? But at least they're starting to change this, right? At least they're starting to get this feeling of like, oh man, I want this to be better. I want this to be the best they can. And as a leader, you don't look at them and say, that is trash. You look at them and say, hey, let's talk about it. And you can sit down and then you can walk through why maybe it's not the best idea, but now that you have buy-in. Now you've changed the atmosphere where they are feeling a part of this whole process. See, I know you're not offended. Oh, you're welcome. She's like, I gotta leave. I'm not offended. But so now as they're coming to you, you've created something where now the creative energy is flowing through them, and you have a chance to sit down and say, hey, let's talk about it. Tell me more about it. And as they flush out the idea, even in their own mind, they may come to say, oh, maybe that isn't the best idea, but you get to something where they are part of that process. And so action is awesome. Hey, this is what we're going for. This is what we're doing. And if you're really trying to create this attitude of, okay, I want to be a part of this, and you're creating this creative and you get to this part of atmosphere, when you give your talk, when you give your speech, when you give your presentation, and you've created this place where people are like, man, I'm actually a part of this. I'm not just some number or some person who's clicking the thing, but I actually am a part of this. And like I said, it doesn't mean you take all their ideas, but if you allow them to feel part of it, the attitude will change in such a way so that when you get up and say, this is what we're doing, everybody will be like, yeah, let's do it. And it may be the most difficult thing. You've got to take down that mountain. And they're like, let's do it. Because the atmosphere is such a place that we want to be a part of this. So our talks have to be, once again, I think, just littered with, and like I said, I think this younger generation, I think before, like in the 50s, 60s, somebody got up and said, this is what we're doing. Everybody's like, all right. I think if we're going to change and understand the culture that we are speaking to now, we have to work to create the atmosphere that draws those younger people in, that draws, I think, even older people in. And I think we do that by saying, okay, here's the information, I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to try to translate you about what this means. But then, man, what we're really for is I want to transform the way you even feel about this company. And there's a whole lot of ways to do it. One example, or maybe two, of things that I've done before that If I was in your church, you would kick me out, maybe. And maybe my people wanted to as well. I think that as we communicate, so there's this parable in the Bible, and where Jesus talks about there was a man who went out to sow some seed. And there's 4 different paths. There's the hard path, there's the rocky path, there's the path with thorns and thistles, and then there's the good soil, right? And so what I did, the point of the passage is not the soil, although that's important. The point of the passage is the sower. You know, if I was a farmer, I wouldn't go out and sow in a hard, I would make sure the ground was good, right? I would just do the good soil. But this guy's just throwing seed everywhere. And so I had 4 jars that kind of represented, and I tried to set the jars up, these glass jars of all the different soils. But the point of the thing is the guy's just throwing seed everywhere. So what do? I just start throwing seed everywhere. Literally everywhere. And I'm like, hey, don't worry, I talked to the custodian, and we're all good. You know what I'm saying? But I'm literally just flinging seed all over the place to show them that is so foolish, but at the same time, you never know when a seed is going to grow. It's not about just, sometimes we in the church say, well, this person will never want to hear about this. Well, that's not your job. Your job is just to throw seed everywhere. And so it just kind of gave the picture. And then one more, Jesus tells a parable about that the kingdom is kind of like this pearl, and it's in the midst of all this junk, and this guy goes, sells all his stuff, so he can buy this one pearl. So when they came into the sanctuary that day, the stage was literally littered with trash and junk and antiques and stuff. Because when I came in, I wanted to create the experience and the atmosphere. They come in and they're like, what in the world is going on this morning? And I'm a big Alabama fan, and so I had it hidden. So I was like, oh, look at all this trash. And I had this big Ohio State O. I was like, look at this. And I'm like, whoa! And they're like, it was awesome. But it drew them in, right? It allowed them to laugh. It allowed them to be a part. And I said, this is what this parable is saying, is that there's all this junk, but there's this pearl of great price. Oh, no. Jesus tells a story about you don't throw pearls to pigs. So what do? Like, it's ridiculous. I got a pig, not a real one, porcelain one, and I got these fake pearls, and I'm like, it's like, has anybody ever been tempted to do this? And they're like, no. So Jesus has to be talking about something different. You know what I'm saying? And so is it taking things that we see and trying to demonstrate